Hi, thank you for this opportunity. And my name is Vaishnavi. I'm currently in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. It's around 9:30, 9:45 right now. And I'm here to talk about accessibility in general, accessibility practices, web accessibility guidelines, and some framework. That's a good practice recommendation when we are developing websites and kind of some call to actions that you can take a look at. So the title of my presentation would be Bring Swagger and Allyship to API Documentation. You all must be wondering what allyship is. So when you look at A11y, it's 11 characters in between. So accessibility is 11 characters. Similarly, you will have localization, globalization. You'll have the first letter and the last letter, and all the characters in between. The count would just come as like that, right? So just check in. I'm sure it's nice and sunny in Pune, or and perhaps it's snowing in other parts of the world now that it's like we are in the northern hemisphere. It's pretty snowing. It's like -15 today, so it's bad, but I'm sure it's going to be better wherever we are. And feel free to sign in and out, pause presentations at any point. Hope you stay with till the presentation, right? So when you talk about accessibility, right, it's not just seeing a person with wheelchairs, seeing somebody with a cane, right? Accessibility could be mental, could be physical, could be situational. So whenever you think of accessibility, think of a bigger picture. Think of all the things that you can see and not see. So this is a good picture that encapsulates what different kinds of accessibility needs look like, right? And like I said, some disabilities look visible, some don't look visible. So you could, the first row, obviously, it's very self-explanatory. You could actually see all of them. The second one could be cognitive, could be neurodivergent. So yes, so always think of those aspects as well when you think of accessibility. This is from Microsoft, and there's a Twitter follower I follow for all the accessibility guidelines. It's a picture from him. Uh, so when I was talking about accessibility, right? For you, it could be somebody who's always in a wheelchair, but maybe you're driving and you want to text. So you're technically operating with one hand. That could be a situational accessibility. I'm a mother. I could be breastfeeding and perhaps working. So I'm able to use only one arm, or maybe I'm cooking and I'm also trying to watch something to get instructions. So there's only limited amount of attention span. So when I'm talking about accessibility, always also consider aspects like situational accessibility. Same thing when you're talking about speech, you only think of person who's deaf and dumb, who has issues with talking. But then what about people who have issues with accent? Maybe they're not native English speakers. My favorite is hearing, right? Uh, Imagine the time when you had an ear infection, or you had some injury into your ear, then that brings aspect of situational accessibility. So when you do design for accessibility, it kind of caters to everyone. And sometimes we all go through some situational disabilities, and then even those things come handy to us. uh, I don't know, show of hands, how many of you know what curb cut effect is? Yeah, sorry, I'm not able to see the picture here, but this is a very universal concept in the world of disability, right? So the curb cut effect here is actually named after the curb cut which you actually see in pavements in many parts of the world. It was only implemented in 1990, so it's not even like more than two and a half decades, perhaps the time when many of us here are born. So it was originally designed to say, okay, all there was a big disability movement, and then many people in the wheelchair or people who had difficulties navigating roads in general and had to depend on others wanted a smooth flow where they could transition from one point to another, and then there's a curb that would help them elevate and de-elevate while crossing the road, right? Now look at this benefit. Now it was only designed with the whole movement of accessibility, but look at some delivery guy, a cyclist, perhaps somebody who's skating, a person with a pram, a stroller, and then a person with a suitcase, right? Now when you're thinking of disability, you are only thinking about the person with the wheelchair, but imagine all these other use cases, scenarios which are benefiting. So that's the beauty of disability. When you actually design for disability, you're catering to a large set of audience. It's like you're just thinking you're addressing the small subset of users, perhaps the edge case, the what do you call, yeah, the edge case users, the users which are not in your normal distribution of workflow. But then when it actually benefits, it lands up indirectly benefiting everyone. So don't look at accessibility as an afterthought, but try to embed it, because it could be situational to somebody at some point in time, right? Oh, yeah. So think of accessibility as a movement, not just an abbreviation. It's a nice play of word calling allyship, but yeah, it's also a movement, right? So also, um, I perhaps could be using the terms accessibility and disability interchangeably. I'm not an expert. I just learn things out of curiosity, and having some family members go through certain things that made me want to make design decisions better UI UX. So that's where my whole study came from. So I'm using interchangeably, but there's a lot of difference between them. So I'm focusing more on just talking about accessibility and accessibility guidelines on the web. Yeah. So, and then you, like I said, why do you care? Imagine you're sending a picture or you're on a limited Wi-Fi. You just send, and then the picture comes, and there's a bandwidth issue and the picture doesn't show up, right? Or you perhaps hand over some old gadgets that you no more use, something that's 5 6 year old, to somebody, or someone who's not fluent in a language, someone who uses technology once in a while, like my father. Maybe he would like to book a ticket once in a while, and that's it. He doesn't want to go beyond it, and occasionally checking some WhatsApp messages, right? Or elderly people who actually have difficulty figuring out, or you have fat finger, you're not able to click often, and you need like a big set of area to be able to successfully click on something without actually garbling with a lot of messages. So you should care, because you are actually catering to children, you're catering to adults, you're catering to elderly people, you're catering to people who are not native speakers, right? So always think of who you're writing for. So one of the so there are many accessibility guidelines, but my personal favorite has been something called a SCULP framework. This was actually developed in UK by Worcestershire City Council, County Council, and that's where I took this image from, and it's pretty good. I would highly recommend all of you to go check it out. I look at some are very intuitive. Like if I just tell you the name, you pretty much know what it is. But let's go forward and talk about each one of them. So SCULP framework, as an abbreviation, SCULPT, structure, color, images, links, plain English, and table. Some are very intuitive, like structure, right? So when you're talking about documents, in our example, let's say HTML documents, you would have to structure. Uh, and what I mean by that is, let's say you have a document, you have H1, H2, H3. What if somebody uses H3, but not saying with an attribute H3, but using size, font size 15 or 20, right? It doesn't help, because when you talk about assistive technologies, or for example, screen reader here, it is able to analyze elements based on the attribute. So it's a header, it's an element, it's a paragraph, or it's a general text, right? So whenever you're using semantic HTML, you should organize your documents. Don't just play around with font sizes as a way to render content. Use elements. If it's a list, use list. If it's a menu item, use a menu item. It's a bullet, use bullet. Don't gobble a radio button with a checkbox and vice versa, because when your screen reader starts picking up things, it actually starts reading the way it is and starts looking at the semantic HTML attributes. There's something called ARIA. I'll come to that in a bit. And then we're talking about structures, right? So when your assistive technology is actually talking of, is picking up and then reading out to you, it can scan for bold text. Then it identifies and it knows that it has to emphasize on bold text, or it has to emphasize where there's a header, where there's a heading or a subheading, right? So these are the visual cues. Imagine you're reading, closing your eyes. When you have the correct attributes and annotations, your screen reader is able to pick those up and render the content to you. That's exactly what it says. Adding section headers. Wherever it is paragraph, use paragraph. Don't use text as emphasis, right? If you just want to bring attention, maybe as a sighted user, you can make it bold. You can make it font 56. It doesn't matter to me, but for a screen reader, it doesn't know that it's actually a heading. So be very judicious of how you're structuring your document. So exactly, right? This is what I've covered. So H1, H2, you should be prudent in using the correct structures than playing around with fonts and bold and other HTML elements. Yeah. So while talking about when accessibility guidelines and the framework, which is called, there's something called ARIA, which is accessibility rich internet application. So when you're talking about HTML, you're talking about the tree, right? The document access model, document object model here. So this is the tree here. So you have, okay, this is a phone on the left side, but it could be uh, a PC or any other application. So when you have the main element, I have a demo. Maybe I can show you through the demo. It's much easier. But whenever you have the accessibility tree or the DOM object, document object model, you think of the hierarchy. You have a div element, then you have sub elements, then you have menu item, menu, and then you have menu item. So each of this, they start navigating top down and then render it as accessibility tree here. So it starts like that. So use I'll get back in a bit on how to use ARIA and when to use ARIA. Maybe I'll come back to this slide in a bit. That way we can talk about this in detail. Now, so when we're talking about ARIA, I have a demo here. We okay, maybe I don't have a double monitor here. Okay, I'll apologize for this goof up, but we can go back and forth between the document. But this is a simple HTML document, that HTML page that I created. So you see it's, oops, what just said? Nothing fancy. You have elements, you have simple HTML attributes, right? HTML5 attributes, you have checkbox. You also see something called ARIA checked here. You have ARIA value min max. So if this were a screen reader and if you were to open this on a browser div is essentially useless in a browser. But then when it is reading, it thinks that, oh, it will tell you reading progress bar. And then it knows that if the default selection is at, let's say, 75, it says the progress bar selected at 75%. That way, your screen reader or your assistive technology can tell you at what state it is. Or if it is a checkbox, it could tell you a selected attribute of the checkbox. Otherwise, it would not know. Think of tab index. When you're tabbing it, you actually go from one to another. Imagine you say uh, index 1 here, tab index 1 here, and then 5 in the next one, and then 4. It is not sequential. So screen reader actually uses all these attributes. However, be very careful of when to use, when not to use. It sometimes is better not to use ARIA attributes than misusing it, because always the first preference is for your source element. We'll come to alt later, but these are your traditional HTML attributes, right? So for screen reader, whenever it sees ARIA attributes, it tends to focus on that first because there is a meaning. However, not all browsers support it. Not all browsers may support 100%. HTML5 has evolved to the extent that many things are self-sufficient. So when you're looking at the DOM model, so you have this HTML body. So think of each of them as a hierarchy. You have HTML, then you have body, then you have header, a paragraph, then you have menu items, images, all of that as a hierarchy here, right? When you have these and you have, for example, where is it? This example, this slide, ARIA checked. So the presentation was talking about role, state, value, name, right? So when it is role, you say, what is the role? What is the responsibility of the element or the attribute? It's a checkbox. Perhaps it's selected or unselected. What is the role? It's essentially the attribute. What is the state? It's checked or unchecked. Value, is it default selected or not? So that is where you're saying it's default not selected. So when your assistive technology or screen reader is rendering, it knows that it's default not selected, because screen reader doesn't have that intervention. It goes sequentially the DOM hierarchy. Then what is the name of it? So let me see if there is something with the name. Yeah, so this is an example. So it says a div. So most of the time, div is essentially in the HTML realm. It's you don't add any value to div. It's just for separation, right? So you're saying that this section is going to focus on top tweets, and it's going to talk about a button, and then it says div elements are not focusable by default. Now, when you use these attributes, your screen reader will know that this is the focus it has to. It actually says top tweets on, and then it will tell you what it is supposed to do. It exactly knows how to structure this. If it was not there, it wouldn't have known. But if it is there, but don't displace, let's say, a label with a name. If it is incorrect, you will land up with a lot more issues with screen readers messing it up than using it. So there's a saying that no area is better than bad area, right? So always be very careful. So each of these is just similar to any HTML attribute. You have the name, you have the state, you have the role. So this is one such example. Colors, I think it's pretty straightforward and intuitive. I don't know if I have to go to a great length about it, but when you're talking about colors, also think about people with color blindness. And when I was talking about situational disability, think of people, perhaps you're at a very sunny place, you're at a place where it's so bright and sunny that you're not able to actually focus a lot on your screen, or there's too much of sunshine coming through your window, right? So, and that's where you start playing with contrast and resolution, right? There are some recommendations on what's a good contrast, what's a good foreground color like, what's your hexadecimal code like. So these are the general contrast. You can already see when I was playing around with these contrasts, how there's a good variation of what my background and foreground content on the first three bullets look like against the fourth and the fifth one. It's slowly kind of degrading in terms of readability. So yeah, that's a good way to use. Again, different browsers, different screens, different recommendations, but you can always go with the standard recommendation, which I found in the accessibility guidelines, and it suggested a good contrast ratio, right? Yeah, when you're talking about color, it's very important that you don't just use colors to convey information, right? It should also be accompanied by text. And I'll tell you with some good examples on why this is very important, right? You, it's to address people with color blindness. Imagine you're in you see a traffic light. You always know that there's a sequence: red, yellow, and green. There are many people, perhaps it is told that the most common kind of color blindness is, I think, red green color blindness, if I'm not wrong. Imagine if that was the case and you mess up the order of that, people wouldn't know what color is what, and then it could lead to a lot of confusion. So color alone is not the way to communicate information. As long as you maintain the sequence, I know that even if I don't see, the first light is red light, so it's on. That means I have to stop the vehicle, right? So think of that example, and then let's come to some real world example. So I just made a quick table here. Maybe this is a university course using colors as a traffic light check mark to say which is mandatory, which is optional, and which is compulsory, right? So if I just use here, imagine I'm red green colorblind. I wouldn't know that this is red or this is yellow or this is green, because again, red green is very common kind of a color blindness situation here. It's not accessible, so maybe for me everything looks fine because I know what it stands for. This is how it actually looks for a colorblind person, or something to the effect of this, if not like this. So there was no way they would know that this is mandatory and this is optional, correct? So this is a good example. If you just strip off the colors, you just say, oh, this is required or not, which is pretty straightforward. Or you could just do this and then use the colors if you want, which is an add-on, but that alone is not recommended. Again, another example of some charts, perhaps when you're using it in a presentation or when you're using in the realm of data visualization. Lots of colors going on, and you provide a legend here. But if I were to be colorblind, I wouldn't know what all these colors really mean. So this is how it looks like. There is no way that I could differentiate one gray over another. Another good example here, use of colors. At the same time, the way shapes, the way lines have been structured are different. There's dotted lines, or there's a straight line, and there's also a variation in the spacing. So the legend here, the colors here, plus a differentiation in all of these attributes help identify one over another. So one of the recommendations that I strongly go by is, imagine if you were to strip off all the colors, or maybe your image or whatever you're working on, try to change that to grayscale. There are very easy ways to change any image to grayscale, and see if you were to do that, is your messaging still being communicated? If that's the case, anything you add on top is a cherry, which is good. But if that's not the case, you have to go back and fix that original design, which is to ensure that it is catering not just so it is not solely depending on the colors, but it's also depending on the content and the communication alongside the colors. Yeah, yeah. This is a good example where the colors are used, and even with the grayscale, I just turned on the grayscale mode on this image, and then it actually looks fine, and there's still a way for me to differentiate one over another. Yeah. Another good example I would find is if people have been using REST APIs, are very familiar with API documentation. Swagger is a great example. I personally like Swagger for that, because it just helps me to understand and test API, also add some security, right? So they're using colors, but they're also using the text here. So this is post, this is put, delete is always like a warning or not to do things, so it's more in red. But they also follow it additionally by text, which is a great example of how a good user-friendly design or API documentation or a REST API should look like. I also like the way that in Swagger, for example, if you're designing, I highly recommend all the APIs have Swagger or an equivalent of that. There are many other alternatives right now to ensure that whenever you're testing, or Postman perhaps, you are able to actually use these to your advantage and test your APIs. So here, if you see, it's talking about the delete parameter, and if you were to test it on the browser, it not just tells you the information, but it tries to highlight where it is. And for a person who's not able to see where it is highlighted, again, it's red, right? You would see that it says star required. That means I know that it's a required field. That's why it's getting highlighted, and this messaging. Again, it's not just using colors, it's also using colors plus communicating what it means alongside the colors. Error formats again. I'm going to, when we are talking about structure, we were talking about sequencing. Error messaging also should be very readable. If you a screen reader were to be picking it up, of course, this is what you would see in the browser. But imagine you're able to use your JSON and then parse it to write the status like this. So your screen reader, or if you're using any kind of technology to, or for a person who is not very familiar with all these, it just feels very garbled for them. The detail can actually tell them that this is, maybe they have used a typo in a method, the method does not exist, or they cannot use methods in this scenario, right? So it's not just for the accessibility perspective, but it's also for somebody who's novice, those occasional users that we were talking about, who for whom that can also help. So this is a great example from MailChimp on how they format their error messages in JSON. This one is very straightforward. So in this cult, we are now in the U. When you're using images, don't just use image because it's easy, right? It has to support the text, because there could be a low bandwidth where your images are not loading. Then what's the alternative? I would say alt is a good way. It at least tells you that this picture is optional, or what the purpose of this picture is. Maybe If it is something that I don't know, or sometimes there are times when on phones and other modes you would turn off loading images, then you know that it's optional, you could ignore it. And then also don't go overload with the size of the image, so that again you're catering to the bandwidth. Alt images, so when the image doesn't show up or when a screen reader picks up, it actually is able to say alternate and then tell you what the image is about. So if you were to if you're using text only because you want to make it, if you're using image only because you want to use a text, prefer text, because screen readers do beautiful with text more so than image. And so always think of using text as your best option unless there is so much information that you want to convey through an image. So that's a call to action on the image part. I'm just checking my time. Okay, so I have another 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, you do have time until 12 p.m. So almost more than 20 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So alt is a great example. So if you were to write 5 lines, instead make it as a paragraph or format it in a way you're able to render it on the browser than dump all of them into text. Unless I know an example where people kind of use image, for example, in Twitter, but because characters are limited, so they dump all that information as sequence of images so that everybody can read it. That's an exception, because the way uh, the product is designed is to limit characters. But in an ideal world, if you're catering, if you're a company who's catering to various audiences, especially children or adults, or sometimes nowadays in the car we also use screen readers to read back or ebooks, right? So always consider text as your preference, and if it's image, at least be very judicious in using the alt attribute. Yeah. Link. I don't know how many of you actually have seen links that says click here, look back, click for more information, refer to the blue box. Now, again, in an ideal world, this looks simple. This looks like, yeah, what's the big deal? But imagine a screen reader actually telling you, and then here could be a link, but then your screen reader doesn't know that here is a link, or refer to the blue box. It doesn't know. It's extremely abstract for it. So go back, look at your buttons, your hyperlinks, or wherever you have a call to action on your website to see, are you saying this or that. Then I would highly recommend, forget assistive technologies, to just go back and say no. Instead of having, can you have a very usable uh, kind of a usability guideline or a user guidance message which is better than this? Or for because we are talking about the Sculpt framework, we are talking about Worcestershire. Oh, that's a mouthful. Website, right? If you were to put this, it said, oh, okay, I shouldn't be using click here or read this or do that. Okay, can I just list the whole website? For sure. But then imagine a screen reader picks this up and literally goes about it, https:// and then goes about doing this for at least a minute or two. Again, that wouldn't suffice, because screen reader wouldn't be able to differentiate or identify a link on versus a text, right? So it would go pick on character by character and then read it out to you. So instead, if you were to just say this, chuck all this as a hyperlink and use the title as a Sculpt accessibility page. So even if I, not just a blind person, but I'm using my screen readers or assistive technologies to read it back to me, I know that it's talking about a link and not just gargling few characters and literally character by character to me. Uh, Another thing, the other aspect of Sculpt, the P part, plain English, right? So we are not talking about fancy terms. We are not talking about people who are qualifying for IELTS, GRE, or TOEFL. Here when we say reading of a mid to high school level, it's not just because we are not. You could say we are catering to English users for sure, but then how many of them are native versus how many are non-native? So many people for whom English is not the first language. Keep it really simple. Avoid using a lot of metaphors and avoid using a lot of jargons, because, for example, AI could mean artificial insemination in some context versus artificial intelligence, it depends on what audience you're talking to, right? It becomes so much more ambiguous. And then the acronyms, it's very situational when you use in one situation or another. So when you're talking, when you're having websites, when you're having documents, cater to simple English that reduces ambiguity. Plus, what's the bonus? It caters to people who are not very well versed or who are not native speakers. Yeah. So another guideline in the SCULP framework is be very uh, quantify your measurements, right? You say instead of a handful or instead of a few, you could as well say use 3 teaspoons instead of say using a handful of. That way, you are being very specific, and there is no ambiguity. You can say 3 teaspoons or a tablespoon or whatever the quantity is, than just using few, many here and there. Again, wherever possible, use nouns because we don't want to get the references right, incorrect. It could become repetitive, but it's better to be repetitive than being incorrect. And never assume that users know everything. Always write, design websites or your guidelines in a way that people know. People can come and say, I'm coming on a blank slate, I'm coming on a clean slate. This is my way of reading it and then analyzing it and then kind of having a visual map in the mind. The last one in the SCULP framework is table. Again, very straightforward. Some of these are super straightforward, like images and tables. So when you're using table, maybe you have some fancy information. You're not just using table for a decorative purpose, meaning you just have this content, you just had to put it in a grid sort of a situation, but then it's not catering. Ideally, when you're doing data visualization or you're just writing tables, use it when you have data, because when again the screen reader picks it up, it knows that it's a table and it's actually catering to data, because it's going to go a long way in terms of getting accessibility right. ARIA is a good guideline, but there are so many browser issues, and there's HTML5 that's doing a great job of introducing attributes and enabling it to be very assistive technology friendly. But there's still a long way to go. It's evolving as we speak. So be very judicious with respect to your tables. So when you're talking about tables, think of it more of data, not just your content where you just want to bifurcate and just add it in different columns. It's that's where, yeah. Also think of screen readers when you're using split cells, merge cells. How is your data going to be rendered in terms of assistive technology, or if you have nested tables, for example. So uh, it again, when there is a situation, you could always do it, but then don't do it because you have to do it, right? Also, if your table is very poorly formatted, it can get very difficult for your screen readers to pick up. And it's like, imagine you just have your arrow keys on the keyboard and they are just using a tab. If it is properly indexed 0 to 1 to 2 to 3, it's good. Otherwise, if you're illogically placing things, how would that situation look like? So if that's the case, it's not a table, it could be something else. So you might want to go back and see how it is rendered. But if it is data that you want to actually render in a table, then it is a table for you. So these are the simple things that we went over. Some super intuitive. Color is my personal favorite, and links over other things. But again, some are very simple in terms of what this whole SCULP framework talks about. So just as a recap, if you have stayed with me for the last 20 minutes, and yeah, this is a good way for you to go back and then ensure your website at least caters to some part of this, right? The other best practices, like I said, sometimes elderly or you're perhaps using screens with smaller form factor or different form factor, you may not be able to click, or sometimes you get fat fingered, right? You just try to click somewhere, it goes somewhere else. For me, it's the date picker that I always get into trouble. I try to click one and it goes to another one, right? So ensure that you're always making it clickable. That means keep it large, at least the buttons where you want people to click. Avoid jargons, don't assume anything, right? And then keep consistent wording. So for example, Like I said, if AI means artificial intelligence, ensure that it means artificial intelligence throughout the page or in your product, unless there's something else, but you might as well call it out, then use and change the document, the definition of AI in something else, right? So uh, whenever you're taking at least some of these things in your mind, you're not just catering to the users who are into permanent disability, but you're also talking about people with the situational disability. And some other best practices: do not capitalize all letters and links. Yes, because it also thinks that you're yelling, right? And another one, we all use tooltips because it helps give user guidance message to the user, but then screen readers may not pick up tooltips. So if you were to use the same tooltip, try considering using it in another format. Perhaps you can just call it out and optionally use a tooltip, because assistive technologists do not understand tooltips. And test on all devices, maybe test on a phone which is 4 years old. Maybe it doesn't work as much as something new, right? Because what we design, we're always designing on the latest and greatest, but ensure that you're at least catering to a, a good 3 to 5 year old product, or uh, phones and hardware and operating systems. That way, you still know that there are a range of users who could actually use older devices. Another a good example of accessibility tool that I want to talk about is, yeah, I have this. I just had some website open. So Chrome, if you're using Chrome, Chrome has an inbuilt tool. It's an open source tool called Lighthouse. So if you just check the accessibility part of it and you say analyze, it's actually auditing the entire page for accessibility, and it also gives you a nice audit report. So many of the things that we talked about in Sculpt framework, it gets covered, right? It tells you some guidelines. It say, okay, uh, it has a tab value index greater than 0. So you could go to pretty much every website, maybe a simple Google, right? Uh, this is very simple. It's just one search button and two text boxes. So it gives you all this. So you don't have to sometimes really go over and above when introducing a lot of new JavaScript widgets or fancy tools. If you're using Chrome, you might as well leverage Lighthouse in this, and then that way it can actually audit and then tell you a good score. I would say 89 is a good score. For me, anything above 80 is a good score, and it also tells you all the guidelines. And we are talking about area, right? The tooltip. It would actually tell you all the messaging information. So that's another great example that I personally like, a Lighthouse. So in passing, we are close to the end of the session, right? So when we are constantly talking about situational disability or disability in general, yeah, this example, this cartoon kind of sums it up. Sure, if I clear the snow on the stairs, it could only help the children, but if I could actually clear it on the ramp, both of them can get in, right? So it's more inclusive that way. So think of it as an inclusive, as a curb cut effect of sorts, where you're addressing for one person at the same time everyone's getting included. So uh, that's my call to action for today. Go back and just revisit your wordings, think of Sculpt framework whenever you're designing websites, and see if you can bring better swagger and accessibility to your documentation. Thank you so much. And I just try to stop sharing my screen so that I can go back and see the audience and questions if there are any.